No one expected a dying puppy in a winter storm to change the life of a broken veteran. But the night Amelia opened her cabin door, something stepped out of the darkness that defied nature, saved her sanity, and challenged the law itself. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a bond the world would try, and fail, to tear apart. What truly happened in those mountains would shock everyone who thought they understood loyalty, healing, and destiny. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Snow drifted in slow, heavy sheets, muting the world until it felt like a memory, half forgotten. Amelia Carter stood alone at the window of her small Wyoming cabin, watching the storm fold itself over the pines. She was 34, lean from years of service, with brown hair tied back loosely and a face marked more by sleepless nights than by age. Her red-brown flannel jacket hung on her shoulders like an old habit, familiar and frayed. The wind pressed against the wooden walls, and for a moment she thought she heard something beneath it. A faint cry, swallowed just as quickly by the snow. She stepped outside, boots breaking the crust of ice with soft, echoing cracks. The cold bit into her skin, but it was the thin trail of dark red across the white ground that froze her breath. It led from the tree line to her porch, unsteady and smudged by drifting snow. For a long moment she simply stood there, listening to the hush of the storm, feeling an old instinct rise, a medic's reflex, buried but not gone. When she followed the trail, she found a small shape huddled against her steps, a tiny black creature, no larger than a mug, trembling weakly. Its fur was soaked, its breath shallow, its life balanced on something fragile and fading. Amelia knelt slowly. "You're just a baby," she murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. The creature didn't lift its head, but its body twitched as if answering her. Without thinking, she gathered it into her arms, feeling the desperate flicker of warmth against her chest as she carried it inside. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in weeks. She laid the tiny animal beside the stove, letting the heat spread gently across its freezing limbs. The fire crackled softly, releasing the scent of pine sap and old wood, scents she had known since childhood, scents that once meant safety. With steady hands, she rubbed the creature's sides, melting the frost from its fur. Beneath the black coat, she saw small ribs rising and falling in uneven rhythm. She warmed milk, testing it on her wrist the way she imagined one might for a child. She fed it drop by drop, her fingers brushing its fragile jaw. As she worked, she noticed details, the fur so dark it seemed to drink the firelight, the paws surprisingly large for something so small, the faintest glow in its half-closed amber eyes. Not a dog, she thought briefly. But the storm hissed against the roof, and the little body shivered in her palms, and instinct told her only this: it needed her. "Raven," she whispered suddenly, the name rising from someplace quiet. "Your name is Raven." The creature exhaled, a tremor loosening into the warmth. Hours passed in slow circles. Amelia sat beside the fire, her back against the old pine wall, Raven curled inside a nest of towels against her lap. Outside, the storm raged, but in here, time settled into something gentler. For months, her nights had been split by nightmares, sandstorms, explosions, faces she could not save. But now her thoughts drifted like snow across a field. She watched Raven breathe, the rise and fall like a lullaby she had forgotten how to hear. The fire dimmed to embers. The wind softened. Raven's trembling eased, and at last his breathing steadied into a quiet, hopeful rhythm. Amelia felt something loosen in her chest, something she had carried since the day she came home from war. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt lived in, alive. She brushed a fingertip over Raven's fur. "You're safe now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. And as the storm broke somewhere far beyond the frozen ridge, she allowed herself a small, fragile belief that perhaps she, too, might find her way back to warmth. Morning light drifted softly through the thin curtains, pale as breath on winter glass. Raven was sleeping near the stove, his small chest rising in slow, steady movements. Amelia Carter watched him from the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. She was 34, shoulders still squared from years of combat discipline. Yet her eyes held a tired gentleness now, a quiet softening she wasn't sure she trusted. Outside, snow on the porch had begun to melt into silver puddles, and the forest exhaled steam into the cold air. Raven stirred, stretching his long, dark limbs, and Amelia felt a familiar warmth gather in her chest. He was only a few weeks old, but something in the way he moved, quick, sure-footed, felt older, like a memory wearing the shape of a pup. His fur had deepened into a black so rich it seemed to drink up the morning light. The paws were large, too large, and his amber eyes were already bright, steady, curious. She had seen many animals in her life. None looked at her the way Raven did, as though reading the places in her she kept hidden even from herself. She reached down to touch him, her fingers brushing the thickening fur. "Too fast," she whispered, and the room felt smaller for the truth of it. By the third week, Raven had grown into the size of a 2-month pup. Amelia measured him twice, then a third time, as if the tape might eventually bend toward a more ordinary truth. But no, his legs stretched longer each morning, and his gait became fluid, effortless. When she opened the cabin door, he followed her into the trees, running through brush and frozen grass with the ease of something born from wilderness, not fire-lit rooms. Sometimes Amelia stopped to watch the way he lifted his head to smell the wind, the way his ears pricked toward the sounds her human senses couldn't catch. It stirred something in her, an ache she could not name. She had known men who went to war too young, who grew up too fast. Raven felt like that sometimes, as if some unseen clock had forced him into a race no creature should have to run. One evening she woke from a sudden panic, heart pounding, breath caught in her throat, and found Raven already beside her bed. The pup nudged her shaking hand with his nose, settling against her chest like a warm stone steadying a storm. Amelia closed her eyes. For months she had handled her nightmares alone. Now she wasn't sure how she had ever managed it without him. At 5 weeks, Raven could outrun her. At 8, he could bring down a rabbit with frightening precision. Amelia watched once, frozen as he sprang forward, silent, fast, exact. When he returned to her with the rabbit in his jaws, she saw no malice in him, only instinct, as natural as breath. Still, her heart stirred uneasily. A dog, even a strong one, shouldn't move like that. Her suspicions solidified the afternoon on the ridge trail. The sun hung low, bleeding gold across the snow. Amelia, dressed in her worn flannel jacket and cargo pants, walked slowly, taking in the quiet. Then the silence changed. She felt it before she saw it, a shift, a tension in the air. A puma, lean and hungry, stood on the ledge above her, muscles tight as bowstrings. Before she could move, Raven, a pup barely 70 pounds, placed himself between her and the big cat. His fur bristled. A deep growl rolled from his chest, older than he was, older perhaps than anything she understood. The puma hesitated, eyes narrowing, then slipped back into the trees. The world, for a moment, held its breath. Amelia knelt beside Raven, pressing her forehead gently to his. She could feel his heart beating fast, fierce, alive. "What are you, boy?" she whispered. But the question felt too small for the truth she sensed. By evening, her decision was made. She packed a canvas bag, lifted Raven into the truck, and headed toward the veterinary clinic in Whitefish. The road stretched long and pale beneath the fading sky. Amelia kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly on Raven's back, feeling the warmth of him, the mystery of him. Whatever waited for them ahead, she knew only this. She needed answers, not to protect herself, but to protect the creature who had already begun to heal her in ways she could not yet name. Clouds hung low over Whitefish, heavy as unspoken words. The veterinary clinic smelled faintly of pine disinfectant and wet fur, a smell Amelia Carter had always found comforting. Until today. She sat in a wooden chair worn smooth by years of waiting, Raven curled at her feet. He was only a few months old, but already large, his black fur gleaming under the clinic's soft yellow lights. His amber eyes wandered the room with quiet alertness, as if he sensed the weight in the air. Dr. Melissa Grant entered with the careful steps of someone preparing to deliver news she did not want to speak aloud. She was in her late 40s, with short wavy blonde hair dusted by early gray, a moss-green winter coat still clinging to her shoulders. Her voice, usually steady and warm, trembled slightly. "Amelia," she began, holding a thin sheet of paper, "I need you to stay calm." She handed over the results, her fingers cold. Amelia scanned the lines. Then she stopped breathing. "No dog genes," Melissa whispered. "He's a pure North American gray wolf." The room went silent. Amelia felt something inside her shift, an ache, a crack, a truth she had sensed but refused to name. Raven lifted his head, touching her hand with his nose, as if choosing her all over again. Outside, the wind carried the dry scent of pine needles and lingering winter. Amelia stood in the parking lot, her breath turning to mist, her thoughts tangled like branches in a storm. Raven sat beside her, tall and alert, his fur rustling lightly. She could feel his warmth through her worn flannel sleeve. Melissa joined her, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "You know the law," she said softly. "Keeping a wolf is a federal offense. They'll want to relocate him. Sanctuary, rewilding, something official." Her eyes gentled. "He's bonded to you. That's rare. But the system doesn't care about rare." Amelia nodded, but the gesture felt hollow. Her chest tightened as memories rose, faces she had tried to save, promises she couldn't keep. Raven had been different. He had let her save something for once, and she couldn't imagine giving him up now, not when he had stitched her broken nights together one quiet breath at a time. When she opened the truck door, Raven leapt inside with a soft thud, curling onto the seat like a shadow settling in familiar light. She rested her hand on his head and whispered, "I'm not losing you. Not now." The days that followed felt suspended, like the long seconds before a storm breaks. Raven began patrolling the cabin at dusk, tracing circles along the tree line, nose lifted toward something old and wild. At night, he would sit on the porch, eyes glowing faintly, and let out low, aching howls that seemed to rise from some ancient memory, and always, always, they were answered from deep within the mountains. One night, the sky stretched clear and silver. Amelia stepped outside, breath catching at the sight of 5 wolves. Standing at the edge of the forest. They were beautiful, lean bodies, thick coats, eyes reflecting moonlight. The alpha, a large gray male with a scar along his muzzle, lifted his head and sang a long, resonant call. It wasn't aggression, it was invitation. Raven stood, muscles taut, the wind stirring his fur. He walked toward them, each step pulling him closer to where he belonged. Amelia felt her heart fracture softly, quietly, the way ice breaks under warming sun. She did not call him back. Love, she thought, was not possession. It was witnessing, even when it hurt. But then Raven stopped, turned. His eyes found hers across the clearing. Moments passed in stillness. Then he walked back to her, pressed his head against her leg, and sat down. Amelia knelt, arms wrapping around his thick neck. She laughed, breathless, and cried into his fur. But the world rarely stays still when something beautiful happens. A week later, hikers on the Ridge Trail startled Raven during one of their trips. They caught the moment on their phones, Raven stepping in front of Amelia, growling low at their sudden appearance. The clip spread quickly. "Woman keeping a wolf," the headlines read. And one cold morning, as Amelia split firewood near the cabin, she heard engines on the distant road. Raven stiffened beside her. Vehicles approached, official ones, marked with wildlife insignias, lights muted, but serious. Amelia set the axe down gently. She knew what this meant. Raven pressed against her leg, silent but steady, and she let her hand linger on his fur. "Whatever comes," she whispered, her voice low and certain, "we face it together." A thin morning mist clung to the trees, softening their edges as though the world were unsure of what it was about to witness. Amelia Carter stood on her porch, hands trembling slightly, though her face remained calm. Years of war had taught her to hold still when fear rose, but this moment felt heavier than any battlefield she had ever known. Raven stood in front of her, larger now, his thick black coat catching the pale light, his body shaped with a quiet power that no longer belonged to any house pet. Down the dirt road, engines hummed. Vehicles emerged one by one, 2 from Wildlife Services, a sheriff's cruiser, and a large transport truck for sedating and relocating animals. The convoy slowed as it reached the cabin, tires crunching softly on gravel. The forest fell silent, as if even the birds understood that something fragile was at stake. Richard Brenner stepped out first, tall in his 50s, with a weathered face and a trimmed gray beard. His olive field jacket seemed too formal for the cold morning. His voice, low and steady, carried a burden of duty. "Miss Carter," he said, "you know why we're here." He wasn't unkind, just tired. A man who had seen too many hard decisions. Raven's low growl rolled through the air, not threatening, but warning. Amelia laid a hand on his back. "Easy," she whispered, though her own heart beat hard against her ribs. The officers gathered, forming a half-circle near the porch. Among them stood a woman Amelia had not expected, Helen Morris, a retired federal judge. She was in her early 60s, her silver hair tucked beneath a beige trench coat, her presence commanding yet gentle. Helen had come uninvited, guided by her own sense of justice. She spoke softly to Richard, her voice like gravel smoothed by time. Amelia couldn't hear the words, only the tone, measured, reasoning, hopeful. But the wildlife team stood firm. "A wolf is a wolf," one of them said, younger than the others, too new to understand the complexities of mercy. Raven remained poised, shoulders tense, golden eyes tracking every movement. Amelia felt the urge to kneel beside him, to shield him with her own body if she had to. She had lost brothers in war, lost pieces of herself she would never reclaim. She would not lose this creature, not the one who steadied her breath when darkness closed in. Voices grew louder, hands moved toward gear. Richard raised his arm to keep order, but tension spread like a crack across ice, thin, dangerous. Then the forest snapped open with a sound like branches breaking under too much weight. A massive grizzly burst from the tree line, foam clinging to its jaws. Its eyes were wild, unfocused, rabid or maddened by hunger. The officers froze. No one lifted a weapon. There was simply no time. The bear charged, earth shaking beneath its weight. And Raven moved. He leapt forward like a flash of night, a streak of black so sudden that Amelia barely saw him go. He placed himself between the bear and the humans, planting his paws into the dirt. His body rose tall, fur bristling. A deep primal roar tore from his chest, older than laws, older than fear, older than the world these men believed they understood. The grizzly skidded, hesitated. For a long, suspended second, two predators faced one another, neither willing to break their gaze. The morning air held its breath. Then slowly, grudgingly, the bear turned. It shuffled back toward the trees, huffing in frustration before disappearing into the shadows from which it had come. When Raven returned, he pressed his head into Amelia's palm, as if asking if she was unharmed. The officers stood speechless. Even Richard's practiced stoicism cracked. Helen Morris stepped forward, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from awe. "I believe," she said, "we have just witnessed something rare. This animal is not a danger to Ms. Carter. He is keeping her alive." Her eyes softened into something almost prayerful. "We must protect this bond, not destroy it." Amelia closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath she didn't know she'd held. Raven sat beside her, warm and steady, as the morning mist finally began to lift. A soft apricot light spilled across the valley, touching the cabin roof as gently as a hand brushing dust from an old photograph. For hours after the grizzly retreated into the trees, the officials gathered inside Amelia's cabin. Their voices rose and fell behind closed doors, weaving through the wooden walls like some distant storm still deciding where to break. Amelia waited on the porch with Raven pressed against her leg. His fur was warm beneath her palm, his breath slow, steady. She kept her eyes on the horizon, as though the mountains themselves might offer reassurance. Inside, decisions were being shaped by human rules, papers, codes, precedents. But out here, with the wind moving softly through the pines, Amelia felt the older law of survival, the one that binds two wounded beings when the world has forgotten their names. She wasn't sure which law would win, only that she could not lose him. When the door finally opened, Helen Morris stepped outside. The retired judge seemed older now in the fading light. Lines around her eyes softened with exhaustion and hope. She wore a long wool coat, its hem brushing the porch boards with every unhurried step. "Amelia," she said, her voice a quiet blend of firmness and grace, "we found a way." Behind her, Richard Brenner appeared, rubbing his temples with the weariness of a man who had wrestled with duty until something inside him yielded. His field jacket hung loosely on his frame, as though the burden of responsibility had made him smaller. Helen held out the document. "A special permit," she explained. "Therapeutic wildlife companion. It's unheard of, but today proved something we couldn't ignore." Richard cleared his throat. "There are conditions: 5 acres fenced, monthly inspections, no public contact, no prolonged reunion with wild packs, full liability." Amelia nodded before he even finished. "Whatever it takes." Raven brushed his head against her hand, sensing the shift in the air. The tension drained from her limbs, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, relief so deep it bordered on grace. A full year passed beneath the slow, forgiving rhythm of the mountains. Snow came and went. The forest changed its colors, and Raven grew, taller than any dog, broader in the shoulders, his black coat shimmering blue in the sun. Yet with Amelia, he moved with a gentleness that felt like an old hymn, something sacred and familiar. Each night, the distant wolf pack called from the ridge, their voices rising and falling like a memory carried on the wind. Raven always answered, but he never stepped beyond the fence for long. His paws always found their way back to Amelia's porch before the embers in her fire grew dim. The nightmares that once tore Amelia awake began to fade, like ghosts losing interest. She slept longer, breathed easier. She started writing again, slow, deliberate pages about survival, about love that doesn't need words, about a wolf who chose to stay when the world told him not to. Veterans wrote to her, strangers at first, then friends. They said her story felt like a hand reaching out in the dark, and she realized she no longer lived in exile. She lived in recovery. On the anniversary of the night she found Raven, a night shaped by wind, darkness, and a thread of fate so thin it should have snapped, Amelia sat beside him at the edge of the property. The sky burned with the last light of day. Raven's amber eyes reflected it back like two small suns. "You saved me from myself," she whispered. Not dramatic, not heavy, just true. Raven lifted his head, brushed her cheek with his muzzle, then turned toward the distant mountains. The pack began their nightly howl, but Raven did not join, not at first. He looked at Amelia, waiting. So she lifted her chin toward the sky and let out a wavering, almost shy sound, a human trying to echo a wolf song. Raven answered her with a long, resonant howl, rich and full, vibrating through the earth beneath them. The pack howled back, but Raven didn't look at them. He looked only at Amelia. In that simple choice, she felt the quiet certainty of a promise. Together they rose and walked toward the cabin as night settled gently around them. Two silhouettes moving in unison, woman and wolf, both reclaimed by love, strong enough to rewrite the laws meant to separate them. In the quiet corners of life, many seniors face days filled with loneliness, fading health, and memories that grow heavier with time. But stories like this remind us that love, companionship, and God's grace can still find us, even in our darkest seasons. If this touched your heart, please share it so someone else might feel less alone. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and join a community that believes every soul deserves comfort and kindness. May God bless you, strengthen you, and surround you with peace today and every day.